For those of you who may not know me, I can't imagine how that's the case, but my name is Allegra, and I work both in our IndiePod community as the community manager and here in Alitu as podcaster success manager, helping all of our podcasters um, to dream up, create, launch, and then enjoy their podcast so that the world gets their story. Let's get started. We started seeing a bunch of questions inside Alitu chat from folks who were confused about how hosting works. Like, how is it that their podcast episode magically gets from where they are to where their audience is? So we decided that we would put together something really quickly to make it super easy for you guys to see that. So I am going to share something with you real quick here. So what we're going to cover today is podcast media hosting, RSS feeds. Like, what on earth is that? Podcast directories, and then what I have always called podcast catchers, but they're more commonly referred to as podcast listening apps. So first we'll start with podcast media hosting. Why is this important? Because your media host, just like a website host, enables people to find and listen to your podcast. So one question we get all the time is, can I just use my website host? Suppose I have my own WordPress website. Can I just use that? I'm going to say you could, but I'm going to say that you should not do that. First of all, most of the terms and conditions of website hosts say not to use their hosting for podcasting. Why? Because the podcast files can be very large and you want your podcast to be downloaded like a bunch of times, right? So you could also go over the bandwidth or other limits for your media, for your website hosting, because website hosting isn't built for, I will call, the robust stream of information that podcasting requires. So you don't want to get your sites shut down. So you need a podcast media specific host, right? And there are a lot of them. Alitu is one. Buzzsprout is one. Podbean is one. There are a lot of different hosts, but you'll want to make sure that you use a host that is specifically designed to provide podcast media hosting. Why? The first reason, the top level reason, is then you'll get the stats that you want. Because if you just use your website hosting, they're not set up to do the IP filtering or to be able to tell you who listened to your podcast. And when I say who, I don't mean like down to the individual person, but they can tell you whether they were on mobile or a desktop. They can tell you which app they listened on. Depending on your hosting, they can tell you what state they were in. So your website will not be able to provide that level of information, but podcast media hosts live, sleep, eat, breathe download stats. So that's the first thing. You need a podcast media host when you're ready for your show to go live. Okay, so your podcast host, in addition to being set up to give you the stats that you need and to handle the traffic that you're going to send, they do that all important task of providing and hosting your RSS feed. What is an RSS feed, Allegra? Well, I'm so glad you asked. An RSS feed is your address for your podcast on the internet. So it's a weird looking URL like feeds.alitu.com/ and then some series of numbers, most likely. Sorry, I'm taking my watch off because I keep talking with my hands and then Siri thinks I want something when I don't. So your RSS feed is your address and it contains information about you as the host, your podcast overall, and then the individual episodes. So I'm going to show you what RSS feeds look like in just a moment, but it looks like gobbledygook to the average eye, but to the podcast directories and to podcast readers, it is set up perfectly for them to display the information that your listener is looking for. So each podcast has an RSS feed that is specific to that podcast. So you can't like lend your RSS feed to another podcaster. We had that question. I couldn't figure out why they were trying to do that. But yes, your RSS feed belongs to you. Okay. So you upload your file to your media host. They are hosting your RSS feed. So when you upload your file to your host, that new information goes right to the end in chronological order in your RSS feed. So every time you publish a new episode, to your media host, your RSS feed is updated. So if you have 100 episodes in your media host, there are 100 episodes in your RSS feed. And every time you update a new episode, your RSS feed updates as well. That is how the podcast directories make it so that your audience can find your episodes. There are a lot of different podcast directories. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. But when you submit your podcast to an when you submit your podcast to a podcast directory, you use an RSS feed. In essence, you submit your address to the directory, kind of like a telephone directory. Remember that back in the day? I remember watching a rerun of Dick Van Dyke, and there was a phone book. So your address goes into the podcast directory, and that's how people can find your podcast. Some of the more well-known directories are here. And what I will say right now, before we get to the Q&A section is, if you have a podcast and if you want as many downloads as possible, and you want the largest audience you could possibly get, you should submit your show to every directory that will let you, because that amplifies the opportunities for different people to find you. Everybody doesn't use Apple Podcasts. Everybody doesn't use Spotify. Everybody doesn't use Listen Notes, right? But for the folks who do, you want them to find you, so you need to be in their directory. Now, there are a number of different ways that you could submit to the directories, but what I will suggest is if you submit to Apple Podcasts first, there are other directories, I want to say 10 or 11, who pull their information directly from Apple. So by submitting to Apple Podcasts, you're actually submitting to Pocket Casts and Overcast at the exact same time. But there's no harm in submitting your podcast to every directory, and there's a lot of upside on the other end with distribution. Now, if I submit my RSS feed to Apple Podcasts and somebody listens to my show on Apple Podcasts, how do I know that? Because Apple Podcasts is grabbing the information from my RSS feed, which is coming from my host. So every time somebody listens to my episode on Apple Podcasts, my RSS feed tells my host. So that is not a one-way conversation. That is a dialogue. In fact, that's the best way that we can communicate with the directory is through our RSS feed. Once I've submitted my podcast to the directory, Spotify, Amazon Music, whichever one, I don't have to go back to that directory and resubmit my show every time I have a new episode, because the directory is going to pull the updated information from my RSS feed. In fact, you should not resubmit your RSS feed to a directory unless there's a very specific reason you are having trouble. The directory tells you to. But submitting your RSS feed to a directory multiple times results in multiple instances of your podcast. So we saw this a couple weeks ago with somebody who had submitted their show to Spotify like 4 different times, the exact same RSS feed. So they had 4 different listings in Spotify, and each of them had different listeners. So if they deleted 1 or 3 of the extras, how did they know which listeners they might be getting rid of? So you want there to be one source of truth, so to speak, for your show, and that is your RSS feed, which is submitted one time to the directory. When we get to the Q&A, I'll talk about instances when you want to update what's in your RSS feed. But right now, you publish your file to your media host, it updates your RSS feed, and the directory then displays that information. Now, another question that we've seen a lot in the last month or so has to do with podcast apps. And before I go back there, let me back up one. The reason why I have an asterisk on Apple Podcasts and Podchaser in this list is that Apple Podcasts allows you to leave a review. People can rate or review. Podchaser also allows people to leave a review, but Podchaser takes it one extra step, and you can actually respond to the review in the Podchaser platform. So I just wanted to point out that one of the questions we often get is, how do I know who's listening, or how do I know what people think of my podcast? Well, first, I would say absolutely start an email list so people can start a conversation with you. But secondarily, you can get feedback through reviews, and Apple Podcasts and Podchaser give you the ability to leave reviews. Podcast apps Some people call directories apps because they have apps as well. When I'm talking about a podcast app, what I'm talking about is once the podcast has gone through the RSS feed and it's in a directory, the app is what I'm talking about when I say what your listener actually uses to listen to the episode. They may go to your website if you have your episodes posted there. That's true. If you, for instance, for every episode I publish, I have a page on my website that has an embedded player and it has show notes and all of that. So sometimes people listen there, but most of the people, 80% of the people who listen to my podcast, listen through an app. And the reason why I want to make the distinction between what you're sending to the directory and an app is I, as the listener, get to control the app. So sometimes we'll have people ask us if they can change the speed of their podcast or if they can change the volume of their podcast. There are things that you can do when you're publishing to make sure that your podcast has like a minimally accepted volume so people don't struggle to hear it. But on the end, where I'm listening as a podcast listener, I can change all of that. I can change the speed, I can change the volume. So once you have sent it out into the world, you can't control how I experience it as a listener. I know that's kind of a pisser because don't you wish you could? But you really can't. Even if you have published in seasons and you want people to listen to your episodes in a specific order, guess what? When it gets to my app, I can do what I want. That doesn't mean that you should just willy nilly publish things in any old way, but it makes you have to be aware that the listener has some autonomy in how they experience your show. So some things you can't control. So you can't control exactly what your show notes will look like once they leave you, right? You can do a really good job of formatting in the front end, but the volume, the speed, the show notes, all of that varies by podcast app. Here's how Alitu makes sense of this for you because we do want to make it as simple as possible. So each Alitu account includes free podcast media hosting up to 1,000 downloads a month. So if you have 10 episodes and 10 people download each episode, that's 100 downloads, right? That's free. If you have 10 episodes and 100 people download each episode, that's 1,000, right? So again, free. Once your downloads start going over 1,000 downloads a month, if that happens 2 months in a row, we'll reach out to you and say, hey, congrats on the success of your podcast. We want to move you up to the next level of hosting, which gives you 10,000 downloads per month and is only $10. So it's really very simple. So as you're getting started, absolutely use free hosting if you want to, because it's there. And I'm going to show you in a minute how you turn that on. It could not be simpler. The other thing that Alitu does is if you choose to use a different host, we're not mad. We are integrated directly into Alitu with, I think, 8 other podcast hosts. The reason why this is magical is once you have finished editing your episode, you can publish it directly to Captivate or Podbean or Buzzsprout without having to download the file and then go log into your podcast media hosting account and upload it there. Alitu also provides an embeddable podcast episode player. What does that mean? If you do have another website and you choose to create blog posts for each podcast episode, which I think is a great thing to do, you can embed a player into that page so that people could listen to your episode right there. Or they could listen to a little bit of it and then say, oh, yeah, I like this. And then they can go find your podcast episode on the podcast app of their choice and follow. I used to say subscribe. I've been podcasting a long time, so I use some old language. But we don't say subscribe anymore because now that there are many more paid podcasts, if you tell the people, if you tell your potential audience, hey, subscribe to my podcast, they may think it costs when it doesn't. So now I say follow my podcast. If you want a podcast website, Alitu offers you one for free. I'm about to show you one from Pocket Size Podcasts in just a moment. And then Alitu gives you those download statistics that we were talking about. And I know this is going to sound completely immodest since I work on the support desk, but we also have stellar support. And I'm just using words others have used about us. Awesome, stellar, super supportive. We are podcasters on the back end who get what it's like to be new. And we really do want to help walk you through all the steps that are necessary to get your podcast out in front of the people who want to hear it. So these are things that you don't have to go out and buy somewhere else. you can just use what's built into Alitu for these. Okay, so you now should be looking at my Alitu dashboard. So this should look familiar to all of you. So inside Alitu, in order to set up hosting, all I'll do is I'll come over here, I'll navigate to settings, and then I'm going to click on podcast hosting. So right now you'll see I don't have a host at all, but here are the other 7 hosts that we integrate directly with. I always forget Transistor, Lipskin, Spreaker. So we integrate directly with those external hosts, and we also have Alitu hosting. So if I've decided to host with Alitu, here's what I do. I click host with Alitu, and it says, great, you're all set. So I'm automatically set up with free hosting up to 1,000 downloads a month. And now you'll notice that because I have hosting set up, all these other things are available now: podcast details, podcast description, and podcast website. So it is that simple to turn on hosting with Alitu inside your dashboard. Then you'll want to visit podcast details and you'll want to fill this out. Now, I have a sample podcast out here that I changed a lot. So this is not a good description. Your description should actually tell people what your podcast is about so that people will understand what they're going to get if they listen to your episodes. Here is the edit with Adobe that Martin was asking about, where there's a artwork generator linked right inside of Alitu. So this is where I would upload my artwork if I had it from somewhere else. If I use Adobe, once I click save in Adobe, it's automatically going to upload that here for me. Then you want to make sure you select at least one category, but select as many as you would like. It can't hurt you to be in more than one category. And in fact, just like being in more than one directory, being in more than one category gives more people an opportunity to find you. Then you'll set up the rest of your podcast details. And we have a full knowledge base article that walks you through this step by step. But this is how you set up your podcast details. And then once your podcast details are set up and you actually have an episode published, then you can start thinking about distribution. And you'll find your Alitu generated RSS feed right here when you come to distribution. And all you'll need to do is copy your RSS feed here anytime you want it, and then you can submit it to the directories. And below here, this shows you how to submit to Apple Podcasts, how to submit to Spotify. We're going to ignore this one. I already know the team is working on removing this because Google Podcasts is shutting down. And then there are more directories here. So submit to as many directories as you can in order to get your show seen in as many places as possible. What happens after you publish your first episode? How do you host the second? You publish it and it hosts in the exact same way. So remember earlier when I said every time you publish, it updates your RSS feed. So let's take a look at an RSS feed. So this is an RSS feed. I know that looks insane. I know that. But this doesn't look insane to podcast directories and podcast catchers. So you can see in here that this is from Alitu and a podcast called Pocket Size Podcasting. So each episode for Pocket Size Podcasting appears in the same feed. So this is the first episode, and then this is the second episode, right? So as it comes down, each of these is a different podcast episode. So it just continues to publish them one after another in your RSS feed. So once you have published one episode and had that submitted to a directory, you just continue to publish episodes with your media hosts, and those additional episodes automatically get added to the end of your RSS feed and automatically get sent to the directories. If I look at my episodes, now again, this is a hosting, rather an admin account, so I do a lot of different stuff here. But here, this episode has been published. It was published back in January. So then let's say that this episode is ready to publish. I have gone in and done all the editing I want to do. All I do is hit publish here, takes me to the publish screen, and then I can click here to publish it right now, or I can click here to schedule it to publish in the future. So if I click publish with Alitu right now, it's telling me we just pushed this to your RSS feed, right? So I'm going to close that and I'm going to go back here to my episode listing and I'm going to scroll down here. So now this episode says published on March 7th at 12:53 p.m. So anytime I finish another Alitu episode, I can just come here and click publish. Now, if you're wondering why, what are the different statuses here, like draft versus ready? When I have finished editing something, if I have made all the changes I want to in this episode and I say build my episode, then Alitu is going to go out and do all of the post-production that it does for you in the background. It's going to level the volume. It's going to stitch everything together. It's going to apply all your edits. So if I click build my episode, you're going to see it tells me what it's doing. It's doing audio cleanup. And now it says processing right here. So when this is done, it will say ready, which lets me know that I can then publish that to my hosting. If it says draft, that means it is not ready to be published. So if I have submitted my RSS feed to 5 directories, every time I publish an episode, it automatically sends that episode across my RSS feed, and all 5 directories now know that I published a new episode. So when you start publishing episodes regularly, you will know after you've published an episode, it doesn't matter which podcast directory someone goes into. They all update on a slightly different schedule, but within 24 hours, all the directories should know that you have published a new episode, right? So you don't have to go and check in Spotify and in TuneIn and in Listen Notes. As long as they have your RSS feed, they're going to let your listeners know that there's a new episode. If you have questions after today, you have a number of different options. You can always email us at help@alitu.com. Or you can open up chat by clicking that little purple icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen when you're hanging out in Alitu. And it'll automatically pop up our help bot. I know it says bot, but there's real people behind the bot, like me and Jenny. So yes, if you have a question, you can ask it in there. And if you send the note, and let's say you sent it at like 2 o'clock in the morning, New York time. I'm not on at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? Judy is, right? So we have folks that we try to cover the 24 hours of the clock. But if you ever send us a note and you're not online when we send the note back, it automatically goes to your email. So you're never going to lose the question. So you can email us directly. You can go through chat, or any Tuesday or Thursday, you can show up for office hours. And we have the link to the office hours inside the Alitu app in the lower left navigation. And also, we do send it a lot as responses to questions that people have asked. I send that to people a lot. Hey, would you prefer to ask your question live? So then I'll send out the information for how you can get on office hours, but it's not a secret. It's always the same URL that you'll go look at, and it'll tell you what the upcoming office hour sessions are. And you can just book yourself in. So you'll get the link to attend. And then we're there for an hour or as long as you need in order to get your questions answered on office hours. So if another question comes up 5 minutes from now and you think to yourself, oh man, I forgot to ask, it's okay. Email, chat, office hours. Let me talk about some frequently asked questions first, and then I'm going to open it up if you have questions. So by all means, if you have questions, you can start popping those into the chat box, and I will get to them in just a moment. But I'm also going to show you how easy it is to turn on hosting in Alitu. Then I'm going to show you what an Alitu website looks like, and I'm going to show you what an RSS feed looks like, because we get a lot of questions about that. RSS feeds are like Area 51. They're like a big mystery, but they don't have to be. So one of the questions we get often is, can I move my podcast hosting once my show is live? And the answer is yes, you can absolutely do this, but you should do it with caution. So if someone came into chat and said, hey, I want to move my podcast hosting, my first question would be, great, why? Because there are a bunch of pieces to it. And one of the things that I love about podcasting is I want to be able to see historically how my show has done. Well, if I move to a new host, they don't have the information about what happened with my previous host. They have what I do with them from that moment starting forward. Now, there is a new feature. I want to say Captivate launched it about, I don't know, within the last 90 days or so, that will enable you to import your statistics from a previous host, but those those statistics don't live with your statistics from Captivate. They're always held separate. So you can move your podcast hosting once your show is live. You want to make sure to download all the information about how your show has performed until that date so that you'll have that historical information. And then remember that RSS feed that I called your address on the internet? You'll want to make sure that when you have opened the account at the new hosting, you import all your episodes from your previous host, and then you create a change of address for your RSS feed. And that is called a 301 redirect, but it is really just a change of address. So if you move hosts, you want people who visit your link at the previous host to know that you moved, right? Just like if you do a change of address in real life. So the 301 to redirect performs one function. If someone lands on your previous RSS feed, it redirects them to the new one so that they'll know, oh, this has moved, and they can update their records if they subscribe directly, or the podcast directory and player will update the link. So that way you don't lose any listeners. If you move hosting, they'll be able to follow you. Because your average person has no idea what your RSS feed is. Is it okay to be that honest? People aren't that interested down to the level of what your RSS feed. They just want to know how they can listen to your show. So the RSS feed is doing its work in the background. So the second question we see a lot is, should I move my podcast hosting? And I say not unless there's a very specific reason. So my question would be, why do you want to move? Do you want to move because you just heard about a new host? Because that's not a great reason, right? It can be overwhelming if you complicate things. So if you are in a place where your hosting is working for you, I wouldn't move it unless you had a specific reason. So just know, if you come in and ask us in chat, hey, should I move it? We're going to say, why do you want to move it? What is attractive about this other hosting thing? Okay. This is a big one. If I quit hosting, does my show stay available? The short answer is no. You must have a host that is hosting your RSS feed in order for your podcast to remain available, right? So if I had cable and I turned off cable, I'm not going to be able to watch HBO anymore, right? It is similar here. If you no longer have a podcast media host that's making your files available and maintaining your RSS feed, then your show will disappear from the directories eventually. They won't shut it off instantly, but they will turn it off. In order to keep the show available, you have to have it's just like with your website. If you turned off your website hosting, your website's no longer going to be available. Make sense? Okay. Why doesn't my RSS feed work when I submit it to directories? 9 times out of 10, when we get this question, the reason is you have not yet published an episode. So when you submit your podcast to a directory, the point of submitting is they check out your podcast. They want to make sure that it's about what you said it was about, that it doesn't have something that their directory doesn't allow. Most of them don't allow hate speech or inciting people to violence or discriminatory things, or there's all sorts of different things that the podcast host will say, yeah, we don't want that on our platform. So when you submit your RSS feed, the host then evaluates your show to decide whether they want to include it. You don't have to have 5 episodes or 7 episodes when you submit. Lots of people will submit a trailer, which is about 1 minute long, which is you basically telling your audience what they can expect from your show. So if you want to launch your show on a specific date and have episodes live, I would absolutely I would create a trailer and I would submit that to the podcast directories early, like weeks ahead of time before I wanted my show to be available. That way, when I'm ready to publish that first main episode, I'm already in all of the directories and I can publish that episode confident that it's going to appear. And then I can start sharing my directory links with my potential audience. Okay. So you must have at least one episode published to your RSS feed before you can submit it to directories. Okay, why does Alitu, this is a great one. So periodically, about every 90 days, maybe 5 months or so, you might get a note in Alitu that says that the token has expired and you can't publish to Buzzsprout or Captivate. Whenever you're using an integration with a third-party system, and guess what? For us, we're third party to Spotify or to Buzzsprout or to Podbean, right? They don't own us. We are a third party site. So periodically, when you have a third party integration, it is just good security practice to refresh that token, to make sure that you want that to stay live. I'm trying to think what I was doing the other day. I was trying to log into something I hadn't logged into in a long time. Oh, and they now offer two-factor authentication. So I had to go through the whole process again of telling them, yes, Fastmail has permission to talk to my Savvy calendar, right? It is not something that's specific to Alitu. It's just in the world of working on the online. Periodically, you need to re-give permission to any third party that has access to an account of yours. So if it says your token has stopped working, it just means you need to disconnect your integrated host and then reconnect Alitu with that account, and then you're good until they do their next security check. And people do it at different times. So sometimes it'll be every 30 days, sometimes it's 60 days. It always seems to be when you're in a rush and you're feeling slightly annoyed, but that is just a part of making sure that your account remains secure.